She is the founding director of the program in Media and Modernity at Princeton University. She has written extensively on questions of architecture and the modern institutions of representation, particularly the printed media, photography, advertising, film, and TV. Just to name a few, her books include Privacy and Publicity, Modern Architecture as Mass Media, Sexuality and Space as editor in 1992, Architecture Production. She is the author of numerous articles and has lectured extensively throughout the world, including the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Architectural Institute of Japan, Tokyo, the Center of Contemporary Art and Architecture in Stockholm, and the Dia Art Foundation in New York. It's also just to name a few. Colomina has been on the editorial board of such periodicals as Assemblage, Daedalus, and Grey Room. She has also received many grants and fellowships, including the Chicago Institute for Architecture, Fondation Le Corbusier, and the Center of Advanced Studies in the Visual Arts in Washington. Recently, Colomina received a Graham Foundation grant for her research project X-Ray, Architecture, Illness as Metaphor, on which this lecture tonight is based. One more, I did some notes also during, especially after Zita Kopp and Liam Gillick, and was thinking about you, what you think about this architecture on that island. And my interest in your work begins with the question, what influence do architecture critics have when ugly buildings still get built? No? I'm not saying that everything on Vogel Island is ugly, but it's something completely new, what is integrated there on the island. Her answer is to shift the question. Architecture criticism is not concerned with refined or elitist ideas of aesthetics. Instead, contemporary architecture must be thought about in the context of contemporary systems of image dissemination. Modern communications technology means that the most iconic examples of contemporary architecture exist in the minds of everyone, everywhere. As Colomina has said, what is the real contribution of our best architects? Is it their buildings, or is it their idea about buildings? I like that very much. Welcome, Beatriz Colomina.
Thank you very much for your very generous introduction, Nicholas, and also thank you very much for inviting me to be here. I'm, of course, incredibly honored to be part of this festival of ideas, and also to be in Vienna. Vienna has been very important to me, as you may know. My work started thinking about figures like Loos and later Kistler, etc. So Vienna is always in my mind, right? So what will have Thomas Bernhard do or say? And at first, this is, of course, an impossible question for an architect to answer, even, of course, if it's, as I say, such an honor to be asked. Perhaps every architect is a frustrated writer, and then figures like Thomas Bernhard are mythical to us. And if one reads Bernhard, architecture is really everywhere. So many really precise and eloquent details of architectural space appear in his writings. So at first I thought this is an aim for me, but of course that doesn't help in the end much, because for architects everything is architecture, so everything is a space. So I asked myself then a different question. What might be behind Thomas Bernhard's writing that is also behind architecture? And more precisely, what is behind modern architecture that is also behind the modern writer paying so much attention to modern architecture? Bernhard is actually unthinkable outside tuberculosis. It is his illness, is his obsession, it dominates his life, his own body, his writing, his melancholy, the spaces he lives in, and above all, I will insist on this, his modernity. Likewise, modern architecture is unthinkable, as I hope to demonstrate today, outside tuberculosis, in its form, in its technology, in its color, in its philosophy, in its experience, in its influence, etc., etc. So modernity itself, and this is the point I suppose, is driven by illness. The engine of modern architecture is not, as we are used to think, the heroic, shiny, functional machine marching across the globe, but a languid, fragile body suspended outside daily life. The difficulty of each breath, and therefore the treasure of each breath, the melancholy of modernity then. And of course, this relationship between architecture and medicine is really an old story. Architecture has always followed medicine. We can go back to the Greeks and think about the theory of the four humors that was the basis for the theories of the polis. But if we think about architecture as a discipline, from the moment the first academies were established in the Renaissance in Italy, just as medical schools were established at the same time, they were next to each other. And just as medical schools were using body parts, architecture or casts of body parts, architecture schools use casts of fragments of historical buildings for their teaching. In fact, they have the same problem. Bodies were difficult to obtain at that time, with the church opposing it in every possible way. Buildings, of course, cannot come into another building. What is also interesting is this tradition of the body cast, the building cast, lasted for a long time. So you still see, for example, here images of MIT, which is the first architecture school in the United States in 1860. And you can see already all these body or building parts in the space, right? And the same conventions for representing the body's interior were used in the Renaissance to represent the interiors of buildings as well. And as in Renaissance doctors became obsessed with the mysterious interior of the body, cutting into it and dissecting it, then architects also wanted to know the interior of their buildings, slicing through it with section cuts. So the point here is it's no longer a whole body that is acting as the central reference for architecture, but precisely a dissected, fragmented, and analyzed body. In Leonardo's work, for example, cutaway views of architectural interiors even appear on the same page as you see anatomical drawings. He understood the interior of the brain and of the womb as, in architectural terms, as spaces, right? As enclosures whose envelopes had to be cut through to reveal their secrets. In another genre of images, such as these ones, there is no need for cut, as the body somehow pulls off its own envelope so that you can see in. And in a long tradition of wash cuts, as those in the anatomical models in the specula in Florence, sections of the outer envelope are simply removed to reveal the hidden mechanism. As medical representation changed, also did architectural representation. For example, you can look at Viollet-le-Duc, the famous Dictionnaire raisonné. He illustrates this dictionary of 1854 with perspectival section cutaway drawings showing medieval buildings as if they had been dissected. And in the preface to this volume, Viollet-le-Duc, who had been very influenced by Cuvier, his lessons of comparative anatomy of 1800, he called for a study of medieval architecture, he says, as the study of an animate being involving dissection to allow separate study of its parts. Well, in the 20th century, then, to jump closer to our time, it was precisely the widespread use of X-rays what made a new way of thinking about architecture possible. If architectural discourse then has from the very beginning associated building and body, the body that it describes is the medical body, reconstructed with each new theory of health. Modern architecture then, as I will try to demonstrate, cannot be understood outside tuberculosis. By now, this is the incredible thing, we have studied architecture from every single possible view: functional, efficiency, new technologies of construction, the machine aesthetics, formalist studies, and in more contemporary times, interpretation to which I have myself contributed, such as modern architecture and sexuality, or post-colonial theory, psychoanalysis, deconstruction, media, war. But it seems to me that a major aspect of modern architecture remains untouched, unthought of, perhaps because it is because of its simplicity, it being so obvious, so much in our face, as to render itself invisible to critics. And that is precisely the impact of medical discourse on modern architecture. In fact, I think you can argue that tuberculosis shapes modern architecture, the architecture that is arguably still dominant today. The principles of modern architecture seem to be taken straight out of a medical text on the disease, which in the 19th century still gives as cause of the disease unfavorable climate, sedentary indoor life, defective ventilation, and deficiency of light. And of course, it took a long time for all these ideas to lose credibility. As Susan Sontag wrote, the TB patient was thought to be helped, even cured, by a change of environment. There was a notion that tuberculosis was a wet disease, a disease of the humid and dank cities, and that the inside of the body had become damp. And for example, moisture of the lungs was a kind of favored locution, and it needed to be dry out. So modern architects, always so kind of, I suppose, opportunistic, offer health by providing precisely such a change of environment. 19th century architecture was demonized as unhealthy, and sand, light, ventilation, exercise, roof terrace, hygiene, and whiteness were offered as a means to prevent, if not to cure, tuberculosis. In his book, for example, The Radiant City, first published in 1935, both in French and in English at the same time, Le Corbusier dismisses what he calls the natural ground as he says, the dispenser of rheumatism and tuberculosis, and declared to be the enemy of man. He insists, therefore, to detach his buildings with the help of pilotis, these thin columns, from what he calls the wet, humid ground where the seas breathe, and using the roof as a garden for sunbathing and exercise, as for example in this still of a film that he does on top of one of his villas. And of course nobody seems to know anything about the skin cancer, but that will be another generation, right? The same generation that was told to take the sun then will be now like, okay, is this okay or not? But then that will be another story. To reinforce the point, Le Corbusier uses pictures taken from medical tests. So he goes to the trouble to go to medical tests to take these images of lungs as architectural illustration, showing the lungs and their inner workings. Le Corbusier developed in this book also the concept of exact respiration, as you can see there, whereby he says that the indoor air is continuously circulated and clean, made dust-free, disinfected, and ready to be consumed by the lung. Of course, he's talking about air conditioning before air conditioning, right? One by one, all the characteristic features of modern architecture, the pilotis, the roof garden, the glass walls, clean air, etc., turn out to be, when you look at the theory closely, to have been presented in a way as medical devices. Modern architecture then cannot be understood outside TB. Look at, for example, at one of the illustrations in this book, The Radiant City, where he contrasts the old architecture of the center of the city, historic Paris, tubercular Paris. So what I don't understand is why nobody has seen this before, because it's right there in all the tests, right? So why we have blocked that possible interpretation, right? One could write an entire book about the relationship between architecture and tuberculosis, beginning with the active collaborations with architects and doctors in tuberculosis sanatoriums, such as Albert Aalto Paimio of 1929 in Paimio in Finland, for example. Here you have the rooms. I mean, and actually these photographs of the building that appears to be, I mean, if you get obsessed like me, like the X-ray of the ribs, or the clean bedrooms that are so similar to the ones that are being designed for modern interiors at the same time. Well, Paimio had a terrace in the top floor, 7 stories high above the forest, where patients were wheeled out to take the fresh air and the sun. And the terrace had to be closed off at a certain point because nurses couldn't keep up with the number of patients, of desperate patients, throwing themselves off every time they turn around. Modern architecture as a form of assisted suicide, you could say. Even today, they don't let you up into the terrace for fear that you will jump. I visited a few years ago, and I have to kind of talk to them. You know, look, I live in New York. There are better buildings to do that if I was on the case, right? No, they're complete. But then I did a typical Spanish thing. You go up the stairs and open the door, and it was open, right? So and then I went into the door, so you don't argue, you just do it, right? So this is the story of this sanatorium at that time. Later research, of course, demonstrated that there was no scientific basis for this kind of air and sun therapy. Sometimes it even precipitated the end at Paimio, quite literally. The history of modern architecture is, of course, full of sanatoria. You have José Luis Sert, Dispensario Antituberculosos in Barcelona, 1934. You have Jan Ducker and Vijuet Zonestral in Hilversum of 1925. Here you have with all the patients, again, taking the air and the sun. And you have even Joseph Hoffmann, Purkersdorf, outside Vienna from 1903. And many others. Even more significant for me is the impact of medical thought on architecture, and particularly on domestic architecture. The constant preoccupation with ventilation, with sunlight, with hygiene, with white walls. As Ulrich put it in Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, modern man is born in a hospital and dies in a hospital. Hence, he should also live in a place like a hospital. This maxim, he adds, had just been formulated by a leading architect, and another one, a reformer of interior decoration, demanded movable partition walls in flats. So even in Musil, there is so much architecture, so much references to modern architecture in Musil, and always also associated with sanatoria, with tuberculosis. Indeed, it will seem as if modern architects and their promoters were advocating life in a sanatorium. Take, for example, this little book of Siegfried Gideon that I found in an antique store the first year that I arrived in New York. And I thought I was buying this book about the house, Liberated Dwelling, which has this subtitle, Light Air Opening, which is almost like the slogan of a sanatorium. But under the cover of this book, ostensibly on the modern house, we find that more than half the illustrations are dedicated to the hospitals and to sports architecture. You find Richard Docker's sanatorium in Bablingen of 1926. You have the Zonestral of Ducker, also in Hilversum, that we already saw. We see Davos, for example, the Queen Alexandra by Fafeli. Of course, Davos being the site of the famous novel of Thomas Mann, The Magic Mountain. If you are getting interested in this question, go back to read The Magic Mountain, because again, it's full, of course, of tuberculosis, but also full of modern architecture. I'm sure he's describing these very buildings. You continue reading, and of course with patients on on the sun and the illustrations of Gideon book, and continuing with the Gideon book, which I'm already past half of the book and I haven't seen any images of houses. I find images of stadia, of people sunbathing, and of tennis. And finally, I may have forgotten that I bought myself this little beautiful book on the modern house because I haven't seen a house yet. When I get to the houses and I start looking closely and I say, oh my God, but the houses themselves have been turned into sanatorium, no? With the patients lying on this chaise longue in the terrace, this languid, body recuperating from tuberculosis, the convalescent resting on the chair in this Maschafeli house in Zurich of 1928. Or you find that the rooms have been transformed into gyms, as when you find the Marcel Brouwer bedroom for Piscator in Berlin of 1927, or into gymnastic equipment, for example, when you see houses by Le Corbusier or the Richard Docker roof of the apartment, of his own apartment in the Weissenhof of Stuttgart of 1927. And it's not just Gideon, in case you thought that Gideon maybe was obsessed with tuberculosis. He may have been. His wife, the famous Carol Gideon, the famous historian, was also spent a lot of time in Davos. She had suffered from tuberculosis. But there are many others, historians and writers of this period, that continuously reflect on this question. In this book, for example, of Richard Docker, an architect, Terrassen Tip of 1927, he follows the development of the terrace in modern architecture from the sanatorium to the home, starting with his own work, his sanatorium in Beiblingen, to Sonnenstrahl. In practically the same illustrations are used in Gideon's book and in Docker's book, to Davos again. And before we know, we are making this basically seamless transition from the terraces of sanatoria to the terraces of modern house, with diagrams showing the penetration of the sun rays in modern sanatoria and in more modern terrace houses, and we end up with a series of photographs of domestic terrace furnished with exercise equipment, as his own Docker's apartment building in the Weissenhof of Stuttgart of 27, or the swimming pool of Marette Stevens in Villa Noel of 1926, and those actually are not images in his book, but stills from the film that Man Ray does of this house. Another film that one could analyze also in those terms of modern architecture and health. Not only did modern architects emphasize health and exercise, and sometimes they put themselves as their own example. Here is Richard Docker jumping into some sort of pond. This is the architect of Sonnenstrahl, not exactly your typical figure of the heroic modern architect, and who knows whose legs are back but there. So not only did modern architects emphasize health and exercise in opposition to the dangers of disease, but strangely enough, their architecture was understood that way. The buildings became unconsciously identified with the healthy body. For example, I give you an example that is near by. One of the times that I came here to Vienna, I asked the people who have invited me to drive me to Bernhard to see the Tugendhat house, which is not very far away, of 1929, where the villa of Miss van der Rohe, we had been abandoned during the German occupation of Czechoslovakia, and was turned into a gymnasium for young children by the communist bureaucrats who were presumably unaware that the house had been photographed in its early days in exactly that spirit. So you have 1930s photographs of the naked Tugendhat children playing in the sun on the terrace that are uncannily echo in these 1960 images of handicapped children exercising in the living room of the Tugendhat house that had been turned into a gym. So these bureaucrats taking possession of the house, they have no hesitation turning it immediately into a gym. Modern architecture, therefore, was unproblematically understood as a kind of medical equipment, a mechanism for protecting and enhancing the body. Even entire cities were thought in those terms. Think about Tony Garnier's project for an industrial city of 904, with the heliotherapy building of the hospital complex occupying the highest point of the plant, dominating the city from the hillside, and the sports center right smack in the middle of the town, as if it were replacing the cathedral of medieval times. Hell had become a new form of religion. Gideon described the project in his 1928 book, Building in France, Building in Iron, Building in Ferroconcrete, and he says, elevators carried the convalescent in his bed to the generous terraces in which the roofs had been converted. The eye, through the interplay of the various horizontal surfaces, has an impression of the air always separating and hovering. Now, Gideon's emphasis, this is still the heliotherapy building, emphasis on the horizontality of both the convalescent and of modern architecture makes me think that perhaps there's a completely different explanation for the horizontal framing of modern architecture than those that I have myself supported by linking, for example, as I did in my early work, the horizontal window with cinema. Could it be that the relentless horizontal framing of modern architecture is related to the horizontality of its occupant, the TB convalescent lying on the chairs, the paradigmatic client of modern architecture? And it's interesting also that this is Aino Aalto, the great collaborator with Alvar Aalto in this project of Paimio and so many others, even if she's most of the time not in the record. She designed this fantastic chair. So the architecture then of the early 20th century cannot be then understood outside tuberculosis. And this is another thing that starts to happen, that modern buildings start to even look like medical images. Mies van der Rohe, for example, described his glass skyscraper. This is the skyscraper of the Friedrichstrasse, and this is the glass skyscraper of 1922. He not only describes in terms of body parts, he talks about skin and bones architecture, but renders it as if he was seeing it through an X-ray machine. Those images are incredible. They are X-rays, really, of buildings. And Mies, of course, is not alone. Our books of modern architecture are all his library in schools of architecture all over the world are filled with images of translucent glass skins revealing inner bones and organs. Think about Walter Gropius's famous work of 9/11, considered by most historians at the very beginning of modern architecture. And why is it the very beginning? What is it that causes so much surprise in critics such as Gideon and Persner? Precisely that you look this corner, right? Precisely that you look through this corner and you see the inside of the building. And you can think about all these other works of Gropius or the Van Nelle factory in Rotterdam of 1925, or Le Corbusier glass skyscraper, again the glass skyscraper of Le Corbusier, or the shocking department store of Eric Mendelsohn, or George Keck, Crystal House in the 1933 Fair of Chicago with the Buckminster Fuller Diamaxion car parked in the garage. You can say, or the Glass Palace in Holland, or even the Diamaxion Tower of Bucky Fuller. Books of modern architecture, if you start thinking about it, if you start obsessing, as I have been on this topic, start to look like collections of X-rays. And this, I think, is more than a dominant aesthetic. It is a symptom of a deep-seated philosophy of design deriving from medical discourse. It's very curious that architects not only made their buildings look like X-rays, but they were obsessed with X-rays. That's another thing that I don't understand why nobody had seen this before. This is Mies. He himself collected X-rays. Le Corbusier collected X-rays. And they published it. They published it next, for example, this is Mies in his magazine Gestaltung, right, where he puts the silhouette of the head of this woman and the X-ray of the same head next to each other. In fact, the birth of the technology of X-rays and of modern architecture coincide, and they evolve in parallel. So if experiments with glass were numerous in the early years of the century, think, for example, about Bruno Taut Glass Palace in Cologne of 1914, or the house in the hillside by Le Corbusier, by Mies, Van der Rohe never realized. He didn't know how to realize it yet, in the same way that he didn't know how to realize the glass skyscraper in 1922 either. By mid-century, the completely transparent house is fully realized in projects such as the glass house of Philip Johnson or the Farnsworth house of Mies van der Rohe. But it has also become a sort of mass phenomena with, for example, the introduction of the picture window in the typical suburban house in America. And this phenomena happen just at the same time that there is a mobilization against TB, against tuberculosis, involving programs for the max X-raying of the entire population. So what I'm saying is that if the X-ray was a sophisticated technology that was used at the beginning of the century to see if there were problems in people that were already showing symptoms of the disease, by mid-century, everybody had to be X-rayed, whether it's in the schools or in vans that were put next to markets in the streets in the United States. And then you have phenomena like these ones in which you are not only signing your photograph of your healthy Mary to Tom with all my love, but you're also giving to Tom with all my love the image of your X-ray, so you are absolutely clean inside and outside. So it's for me interesting, this coincidence that at the very same time that everybody is X-ray, and that there is this campaign, enormous campaigns to try to convince people of having themselves X-ray, and you will think, oh, they were afraid of radiation. They had no idea about radiation. That's the crazy thing. There were X-ray machines in shoe stores, and there were all these kids, they would go out of school and put the feet in the machine. So imagine where are all these feet now with all this radiation. No, that was not a problem. Fear was the loss precisely of privacy. So it's very curious, right? That at the same time that there is this campaign to acclimatize the population to the X-ray, there is this desire also for the house to be transparent. Just as the X-ray exposes the inside of the body to the public eye, the modern building exposes its interior. That which was previously private is now subjected to public scrutiny. And it's not just the house, everything in post-war America seems to me that it had to be transparent. Where is the cooking Pyrex thing? And look at this this girl and this woman there. The image of health also is the image of transparency, right? All the film to protect your food also had to be transparent. To think about all these windows in ovens and in washing machines. Why do you need to see the washing machine operating? There's this desire to see what was previously invisible. In fact, it's also at the same time that this association between X-rays and glass house becomes common in mid-century. This is the glass house of Philip Johnson, of course. Becomes common in mid-century popular culture. Take, for example, Highlights and Shadow, which is a 1937 propaganda film on the virtues of X-ray in disease prevention, and it shows a woman wearing a swimming suit strapped to this laboratory table where her body is subjected to X-ray, and at the same time that this is happening, that you go from that image to this, the narrator, which is of course a man, declares that this woman, after having her X-ray, will not only be reassured that she's physically fit, but also, most amazingly, the narrator also says that out of the blue, he says that she will no longer feel any terror in a glass house. So how did he make this association between, that she will be reassured that she doesn't have tuberculosis, is normal, right? But she will no longer have any terror living in a glass, terror, not fear, in a glass house is extraordinary. In case you think this is some kind of funny thing of popular culture, exactly the same set of associations can be seen in the discourse around canonic works of modern architecture. In the course of an interview in House Beautiful, Edith Farnsworth, who you see here, a successful doctor in Chicago, compared her famous weekend house, designed of course by Mies van der Rohe in 1949, to an X-ray, and goes on to say that there is a local rumor that the house is a tuberculosis sanatorium. So she thinks the house is an X-ray, and the people in the village think that the house is a sanatorium. So the X-ray and tuberculosis are inseparable from the discourse about the disease. Let me read you the exact quote because it's kind of funny. "I don't keep a garbage can under my sink. Do you know why?" He says to the interviews, "Because you can see the whole kitchen from the road on the way in here, and the can will spoil the appearance of the whole house. So I had it in the closet, further down the sink, from the sink." Mies talks about free space, but his space is very fixed. "I can't even put a clothes hanger in my house without considering how it affects everything from the outside. Any arrangement of furniture becomes a major problem because the house is transparent like an X-ray." That's what he says, right? What I don't understand is why he's so obsessed with the kitchen being seen from the road, when in fact what you actually do see from the road is the bedroom, which he doesn't seem to say anything about it. But the garbage can, oh my God, the garbage can is a major deal. Where do I put the garbage can? Because the garbage cans can be seen from anywhere. Well, anyway, so to jump into a more contemporary situation, we can ask what is happening today at the turn of the 21st century. And it seems to me that the CAT scans may be for us what the basic X-ray was for architects in the 20th century. A new generation of architecture starting, let's say, in the late 20th century, was producing experimental work under the influence of computer-assisted technology that allowed complete three-dimensional modeling of the inside of the body. In fact, the CAT scan, which of course stands for computerized axial tomography, is simply many X-rays images which with the help of a computer are used to generate cross-sectional views and 3D images of internal organs. A large kind of donut machine that everybody is familiar with by now takes X-rays at many different angles around the body as the body lying horizontally is moved slowly through the apparatus. So the camera effectively spirals around the whole body. Listen to how a typical medical brochure describes this operation. Imagine the body, they say, as a loaf of bread, and you are looking at it at one end of the loaf. And as you remove each slice of bread, you can see the entire surface of that slice from the crust to the center. So clearly, the crust, the skin, the envelope has become almost invisible. It's only a line. And what matters is the interior. This dense interior is rendered like a new, more complex kind of facade. And of course, this has consequences for architecture. As with X-ray, architects were very quick to respond. If architectural publications at the beginning and middle of the century are full of X-rays, from Le Corbusier to Mies, we already saw, to Allison and Peter Smithson, here they are in Parallel of Life and Art, even the cover has an X-ray, and even when they were preparing the exhibition, you can see there is this image of an X-ray of a jeep that they have got from Life magazine. They went through all these popular magazines looking always for images for this exhibition, and as you can see, the X-rays are very important to them still, and you can see the influence, the way in which their architecture reflects that interest in the X-ray. Well, if from the early 20th century to the mid 20th century, architects were obsessed with X-rays, and the architecture reflects that interest, contemporary architecture publications are full of CAT scans images. Look, for example, at José Luis Mateo, who is an architect and a professor at ETH, and here is the cover of a 1995 catalog of his work, where he says that the architect has to act with the callousness of the medic. He cuts, analyzes, researches, but he must never mummify an organism that lives once. And CAT scans of the brain appears everywhere. For example, this is a page of UN studio Ben van Berkel and Caroline Bosch work, and it's full of CAT scan. And of course, there is still this obsession, as it was in the Renaissance with Leonardo, etc. It continues to be this obsession not only with the brain, but also with the fetus and with the womb. Think about all the embryological work by digital architects like Greg Lynn. These are all images from Greg Lynn's digital or embryological house project. And here again, images that appear in UN studio work. Architects of that generation were also fascinated in the late 1990s with another medical procedure that parallels the CAT scan. I'm talking, of course, about the Visible Human project, which acts out physically the operations of the CAT scan by cutting the body in 1 millimeter sections, which are then used to generate an animation of section cuts passing down through the entire body. And I show you some images, quick images, to give you a sense of what's happening. Just as with the Renaissance dissection, the invaded body, this body is the body of a criminal that in this case donated his body to science. I may have mentioned before that the courses of dissection were very difficult to obtain with the resistance of the church, who ultimately agreed that only hung criminals were able for dissection. So it became like another kind of part of the punishment. Not only were you killed, but then your body was also going to be dissected. That was, for people, of course, that believe in the resurrection, like a major problem. And you can see, of course, the effects of this CAT scan obsession on architectural envelopes of the late 20th century. OMA's project for the library, for example, or FOA, Foreign Office Architecture Terminal in Yokohama, are projects where the exposure of the skeleton behind the glass skin has given way to translucent bodies, revealing organs in the case of OMA, or complete systems of laws in the case of FOA. Yokohama could even be argued to have been designed on the basis of the logic of the CAT scan. Early representations of the project included this endless series of section cuts that is used to assemble the 3D body. There is no simple opposition between the outside and the inside. His dream is to be a continuously folded surface where structure and skin become the same thing. There are no bones or discrete organs. When Alejandro Zairapolo, one of the principals of Foreign Office Architecture, interviewed Frank Gehry, technical team in 1995, and you have to understand that Frank Gehry was the first one to use computers in his office, and he's, of course, he's a young kid, no? He's interviewing him for a magazine for El Croquis, and he's completely fascinated by all these computers around, and he asked this technical team where did they get the 3D digitizers he had seen in the office, and they say to him, matter of fact, that they were originally used for guiding lasers in brain surgery. They came from the hospital down the street, by the way. So the state-of-the-art of medical technology was being recycled in the architectural studios to generate 3D models in the computer. A series of 3D points is taken from the physical model, and the computer interpolates the surfaces between them to build the precise geometry of the building. The model then is treated like a body about to be operated in or rebuilt through a kind of plastic surgery. So far I have kind of sketched the way the technologies of medical diagnosis became integral to the development of new forms of architecture. But today there are new instruments of medical diagnosis and new ways of representation. And I think we should look into end. I'm going to look quickly into one of these innovations to see what kinds of implications could it have for our buildings. One of the latest technology is this thing, which is called the M2A. M2A is a very little camera. The first ones were like about an inch long. I think they are doing them now much smaller. A disposable camera that is swallowed as a pill and snaps two color pictures a minute for 8 hours as it passes to the 22-foot long digestive tract. A recorder the size of a Walkman, this is in the 90s when it was invented, that is still not. Now it has become available and is used extensively. Collects 57,000 color images where you move around doing your regular business. The images then are downloaded on a computer to produce a video of the camera trip to your digestive tract. Much of this technology began with the military and the entertainment, communication, and consumer electronics industry. The M2A was the brainchild, actually, of an Israeli missile researcher who applied his knowledge of video system used as smart bombs and took advantage of the miniaturization developed by NASA. So the M2A is, in fact, a merging of space and military technology. And in fact, it looks a little bit like a spaceship. Scientists in laboratories are also developing now microscopic machines that one day will prowl through the human body like miniature repairman fixing with what ails us. It reminds me of this film of 1966, Fantastic Voyage. Here you have several posters, Viaggio Allucinante, with Raquel Weisz, which is really striking. A team of scientists is shrunk and injected in the body to repair a brain injury. With the M2A, as in this movie, the body then is transformed into an occupiable interior. The body has been turned inside out. The skin is actually irrelevant. This is all this endless interior bathed in the light coming from the little capsular video camera. The capsule itself looks a bit like a hybrid of the buildings inspired by the X-rays and the CAT scan. A translucent envelope exposes the outline of the inner mechanism where a transparent head acts as the viewing mechanism. What this hybrid makes possible is the overthrowing of both the transparent and the translucent system. The skinless body, then, a body no longer even experienced as a body. All this probably may remind you of Kistler, if you know something about his work, and it's actually not by chance that so many contemporary architects have made projects that echo his fluid geometries, his endless house, for example, which he explicitly understood as a digestive system which can suffer from constipation and all these things. So he thinks about architecture in terms of the body as well. But in Kistler and in much of the computer-generated architecture of the last 2 decades, the skin is turned into the structure. The whole building becomes a kind of flowing, self-supporting skin, a hyper envelope. But what the M2A camera creates, on the other hand, is the possibility of the radically skinless body, the skinless building, the building turned completely inside out to such an extent that it may not be clear that it is a building anymore. Now, what this complete loss of the envelope exactly mean in architecture is unclear, but in an age in which private and public has been so radically dissolved, and of course architecture is always about that, it's about what is private and what is public, what is inside and what is outside. Perhaps an architecture without envelope may be very well upon us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
Are you open to questions?
Yeah, of course.
No questions?
Yes, yeah.
I do have a question regarding maybe a more European situation than US, I'm not sure. But I thought that you would also bring up as a contemporary version of X-ray or analogic image thermography for buildings.
The what?
Thermography, like the images that you would take, that you would do of buildings where they leak heat.
Sick syndrome, or what are you?
No. Where you kind of take a picture of a building where you see in red and in blue and in the different colors where you basically have a lack of insulation.
Yes.
And why I'm saying this, because it's interesting to think of, I would like to ask you if you thought of this contrary relationship of the X-ray dissolving the skin of the building, like creating this transparent skin, and then this thermographic images contemporarily used to actually promote passive houses, more insulation, less windows, kind of doing a counter reaction that's based also on the technology of looking or of vision, maybe with a similar notion of not really knowing what is being done, but totally obsessively being used by architects, at least I would say in Europe or in the world.
Yeah. No, I think it's super interesting that you made the connection, but I don't know exactly how you connect it to the medical. Because
it's the medical in the sense of the well-being, maybe with Rainer Bernhard in terms of having the house being of a certain temperature at all times.
Yes.
Not so much in terms of physical health or so.
Right. But it's a different line of argument, right? Because I was talking about the obsession with the way in which tuberculosis dominated culture in the early part of the 20th century is well known and has been studied in almost every field, I'm sure, in art, in literature, etc. And I found it striking how we could be constantly reading these architects, which are not only making references to tuberculosis, which are outlining principles of architecture, which is you look at a manual of architecture, are exactly the same. And what does this blindness of our part to it means, right? Is it the incapacity of architectural theory to understand architecture as part of culture, right? Or why not to think about all these complications? But no, I don't know. I mean, maybe you have something there that I haven't thought about it, of course. I mean, one thing that I thought is that I misunderstood you. I thought you were talking about the sick syndrome, because I think that's fascinating, the way in which these buildings that were originally theorized and realized so that they would be so healthy has in a way become thrown against us and develop their own diseases. I think that's also interesting.
But it is a bit based on that, and there's also this analogy that I think it was Bruno Taut who also wrote manuals how to use the modern house, or how to use the modern apartment.
Yes.
And it could be interesting to look into, now there's real manuals about how to use the passive house. You know, how the need to, and this is simply not so much with the health issue, but similar questions of how the house becomes secure to maybe at this moment not a body disease, but ecological problems.
Right. It's super. That's super interesting to the manual. No, you need a manual to this kind of a spaceship that is this house, and of course the ecological question is very, very interesting, because now, of course, since the 60s, since we have that image, the first image of the Earth. Then what is sick, what needs to be taken care, is the earth itself, right? And so this kind of transformation in the discourse, I think this is very, very interesting when what you're pointing out, right? The way in which the ecological discussion is also a discussion of health, but it's the health of the planet as well. Yeah, very good, interesting. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question. Thanks, that was a really fascinating talk, and what you're saying about the CAT scan made me think about this idea of interiority as influencing contemporary architecture. Makes me think about the internet, where you have the sense of omniscience, but there's no outside to it.
Outside.
So I think that's an analogy to what you're saying. I'm just wondering if you had anything to comment on that.
No, but it's again a super interesting and super suggestive comment about all this kind of all interior, continuous interior that we inhabit, right? And that the internet represents, right? This world in which there is no outside. It's also interesting when you think about Vienna and you think about Thomas Bernhard and you think about all these characters like Kistler and Loos and so, that they are already inhabiting, I think, this kind of continuous interior. When Thomas Bernhard talks about these cafes and these interiors of the house of his friend, or even the Hermann Pavilion or the Ludwig Pavilion, we are almost never outside, right? Or nothing ever is so interesting outside. It's always about, and when Lors talks about the Vienna of his time, it's also this almost continuous interior, right? From the house to the cafe to the places where you meet, and what is in the middle is almost of no significance, right? How you get from one interior to another. So it's all one continuous space you are occupying, I think.
It also represents nature too, but inside, right? In Vienna specifically, it seems like the decor. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I suppose it's also the interior, the intellectual life of the city that is one continuous interior that you cannot separate from these spaces. And that's what I find so fascinating about Thomas Bernhard and about music, and about Thomas Mann, about all these fantastic writers, or about Proust, right? That in which the description of the space is so important. It's part of the literature. Yeah.
Are there any more questions? Yeah, then thank you very much again.
Thank you.